Hey, I'm a dirty little owl, and in this video I'm going to talk about the USA and the so-called Dark Ages, and I'm going to attempt to make a map of what I'm going to call Dark Ages America. The reason I'm doing this is that I saw the recent conversation between American conservative pundit Ben Shapiro and British conservative pundit and newspaper chairman Andrew Neil, and during that conversation Ben Shapiro seemed to get most upset when Neil said this.
Some of the ideas that are popular in your side of politics would seem to take us back to the Dark Ages, Georgia, new abortion laws, which you are much in favour of, that a woman who miscarries could get 30 years. A Georgian woman who travels to another state for an abortion procedure could get 10 years. These are extreme hard policies.
He's talking about Shapiro's support for Georgia's House Bill 481, which has since been signed into actual f***ing law. Shapiro took issue with what he called
the assumption that people with whom we disagree politically are inherently of bad character or, in your words, want to bring us back to the Dark Ages.
So in the idiom,
back to the Dark Ages,
as used by Andrew Neil,
the Dark Ages
just refers to some nasty, benighted and ignorant time far back in the past in which women could be brutally punished for exercising basic autonomy, which, yeah, was a thing. But I thought, well, although there are objective ways in which so-called Western civilizations have progressed from a more brutal, benighted and ignorant past, the progression could best be described as incomplete. And I wondered if there might be a way to show that, which is, yeah, where the map comes in. So in order to make a map of Dark Ages America, I'm going to collate maps showing 5 ways in which the contiguous continental United States conforms to Europe in the 9th century, slap playing in the middle of what was, although it's no longer called the Dark Ages, a relatively shitty time period. The 5 maps I'm going to use to make my map of Dark Ages America will be based on quantifiable data. That is, I'm not going to be mapping attitudes or opinions, but verifiable, cold, hard, unforgiving, emotionless, bloody data facts. The first map I'm going to use is a map of religious attendance based on surveys through 2014 conducted by Gallup, the famous survey guys. Links to all my sources in the description of this video. Now, although there's nothing benighted, brutal or ignorant per se about attending a place of worship, I'm including this map because if we're looking at the ways the USA is like 9th century Europe, well, religious observance and attendance was undeniably a big thing back in them days. I mean, it was pretty bloody popular. So although I'm not saying religious attendance is intrinsically dark, I'm presenting this map in a way that shows the states with the lightest amount of religious attendance in the lightest colours, and those with the most in darker colours, because them's the states that are more similar to early medieval Europe in this particular way. Okay, the next map I'm using shows executions per capita in each state since 1976, with the darkest representing the most executions per capita. The reason I'm using these data in my map of Dark Ages America is that, whereas most modern Western countries eschew the death penalty, back in 9th century Europe there was a lot of reasons and ways in which you could get executed, and it was again a pretty popular thing. It was a fun day out, and it still is. The next map I'm going to use shows infant mortality by state. This is pretty uncontroversially a metric that evinces the inability of a given state or country to look after its most vulnerable citizens, and the United States has one of the worst infant mortality rates of all 35 OECD countries. The next map shows the relative hostility of the legislative environment of each state to abortion rights as of January 2019. These data are in flux at the moment, as you probably know, and will continue to change. Back in 2010, 0 states in America were deemed very hostile to abortion rights. Now the number is 7 and rising. And the reason I've included this map is because it represents religiously motivated state control over women's bodies and an attitude towards women that can be reasonably compared to those of European societies in the early Middle Ages when, of course, although there may have been rare exceptions, under a powerful and pervasively influential Christian church, women were uniformly disempowered, seen as subordinate to men, as inherently more sinful than men, and subject to the most brutal punishments and tortures if they were to be seen as defying the will of men. The last map is pretty straightforward. It shows relative healthiness between the states based on a United Health Foundation report taking into account behaviours, environmental factors, policies, medical care and outcomes. With the darkest states on this map being the least healthy, obviously, it should go without saying that although modern lifestyles present risks to health that weren't faced by people in the 9th century Europe, Life expectancy back then for most people was significantly shorter than it is now, for obvious reasons such as an almost total lack of medical understanding, extremely high mortality in under 10s, and the risk of being put cruelly to death by the man. Notwithstanding that a lot of the ill health seen in this map will be due to destructive behaviours and excessive consumption not available to 9th century Europeans, morbidity and ill health in general can be seen as a defining attribute of the time period, so I'm including this as a metric of dark aginess. Right, now I need to combine the maps I've just mentioned into a single map of Dark Ages America. And to do that, I'm going to use a Photoshop layer style called overlay. What overlay does is when you put a bunch of images on top of each other as layers, regardless of the order of those layers, it makes the darker areas darker and the lighter areas lighter. So for instance, if a particular state showed up as dark on one map but light on another, overlay would cause it to have a middling tone. The result should be a map that shows which states are more likely to manifest these similarities to the Dark Ages and which are less so. So here we have the base map. And first we're going to add the map of religious attendance, then executions, infant mortality, hostility to abortion, and finally health. And there it is, my map of Dark Ages America. I mean, it's somewhat very subjective and only uses 5 subjectively chosen data sets, and it clearly follows my own fairly obvious political biases, which cause me to see certain things negatively and other things positively. So you wouldn't reasonably expect it to have any correlation to any other data set or map, would you? I mean, it's just some biased bullshit, what I made up pretty much. It shouldn't correlate to anything. But yeah, it does. The obvious thing that if you're a silly emotional leftical like me, you might expect a map of Dark Ages America to correlate to would be support for Donald Trump and or the Republican Party. And, well, yes, it does. But there is one more correlation I'm going to show you, and it isn't that, since voting for a big orange cunt isn't strictly speaking a manifestation of what I earlier very scientifically referred to as dark aginess, being by definition, and in however bullshit and corrupt a way, a democratic exercise. No, the map I found which corresponds most to this completely subjective amalgam of verifiable, cold, hard, unforgiving, emotionless, bloody data facts was this one. It's a map of food insecurity in the United States by county, made by Feeding America, a non-profit that runs more than 200 food banks in the US. The map shows the areas where the most food insecurity is found, taking into account food bank usage, poverty, unemployment, home ownership, food budget shortfall, cost of food index, and national average meal cost. Again, link below. Hunger and the inability to reliably feed oneself or one's family is an indicator of the hard flaw of poverty. It's one of the fundamental human requirements, and if in a modern society people are finding it hard to meet that requirement, well, it's a pretty clear indicator of how that society and the systems which govern it are failing the people who live in it. And what really shocked me was how closely this map correlates to my map of Dark Ages America. So, this is my final map of Dark Ages America. It's a map which shows the relative preponderance of religiosity, deadly state-sanctioned violence, infant mortality, fundamental legislative misogyny, ill health, and risk of malnourishment and starvation in the so-called greatest country on earth. And I'm obviously not going to prove a causal link between the hard flaw of poverty caused by modern capitalism in America and the various similarities to Dark Ages Europe it seems to geographically coincide with so closely. All I can do is wonder if there might be some alternative to the system which has given rise to this situation, and hope that someday someone might come forward with policy proposals to raise the floor of poverty and bring this potentially great country out of the Dark Ages. If only there was some way that we have now, which we didn't have during the actual Dark Ages, to change the way our countries are run.